Hi, I'm Daham with the Architecture Lobby, and I'm excited to introduce Lee Kuhn with Architectural Workers United. AWU is a campaign affiliated with a wider union in the United States, the International Association of Machinist and Aerospace Workers, and has made great strides in organizing architectural workers in this country. Most recently, Bernheimer Architects in NYC has ratified their first contract, which is the first in a private sector architecture practice in the United States as part of your union. So we're really excited to talk to you guys about your organization. And yeah, let's start this interview. So, question one, what have been key moments in your journey as an architectural worker, the organizer? Like what radicalized you and brought you to involvement with AWU?
Well, thanks for having me. Um, I think that question of what radicalized me um, is a really interesting one because I've thought a lot in this process of organizing my office and negotiating a contract about what is radical about what we're doing and what's not, and how that relates to the organizing work. And I think lesson I've learned in this whole process is that while in the broader context, what we're doing is radical, and it's radical because architecture workers in the United States typically do not have unions. The process of organizing, in my mind, was about making it feel not radical in the local space of our office, and that's, I think, sort of the core of the organizing work is how do you make something that's radical in the broader context feel achievable in the local context. And I think we can talk a little bit more about some of the steps along that process in our office. But I also want to take a step back and tell you a little bit about myself personally and my relationship with unions because it goes back to before um, this current office I'm at and before even my life as an architect. Um, I think there are a lot of places where unions touched my life growing up, and which is not always true. And I think in the United States we have a lot of variance in how familiar people are with unions and how much contact they've had in their life with unions. But for me, I grew up in a household where my dad was a municipal worker here in New York City, and he was part of a union most of my childhood, so sort of a union household in some sense. I went to public school here in New York, so union teachers, and I think anyone who's been through public school in New York understands that the teachers' union is strong. They typically are, especially in large cities in the U.S. Um, I received my master's degree in architecture from UC Berkeley, where I worked for 3 semesters as a unionized graduate student worker as part of the UAW, the auto workers. So this is actually now at Sage Kuhn, the second union I've personally been a part of. So I had a lot of familiarity in that sense. I think in terms of our specific office and the campaign at our office, um, I had a number of coworkers who were also very familiar with and interested in organizing and unions. And there's a couple in particular I remember at the early days of our campaign who had conversations with me um, about the possibility of a union at our office. And I think this gets back to where I started, which is I really distinctly remember the feeling of having those conversations and thinking, I love this idea, but it feels so far from where we are now, that it's fascinating to think back on now because the union feels so normalized in our office within our bargaining unit, which is the group of us who are in the union. Um, it's sort of become the normal thing. And it was a long process to get there, but I think talking with colleagues is a big part of it.
Yeah. Um, yeah, certainly familiar kind of with, yeah, we all have these kind of interfaces with the ways in which unions have brought a public good to our lives. And, for us in the lobby and in AW, we like feel this like, oh, of course, like we should have a union. Like this will protect us from the precarity that we encounter on a daily basis and kind of improve our working conditions. But yeah, no, I often
Definitely.
feel like, yeah, with talking to other architectural workers, it's hard to get them to kind of think that, oh, a better world is possible, that we have some agency over this. So for folks who may be watching this and maybe less familiar with a union, yeah, what benefits do you think like a union can bring an workplace for architects?
Well, I think it's a good question because there's a lot of confusion about what a union is, what a contract is, how they relate to each other. Um, but I like to start by saying always that the fundamental nature of having a union in your workplace is it defines a relationship between you as an employee and your employers, and it does that through a contract. And I think a lot of people think that a union contract has to have X, Y, or Z in it, or is sort of pre-written or decided by someone else. But I think what you learn when you do organizing is that the union really is you in the sense that a union, it's democratic, it's made up of the people who are in your bargaining unit. And by extension, what is in your contract is deeply flexible. You can you arrive at the contract by bargaining with your employer, and because of that, you can make it as expansive or narrow as you want. You can choose what to include in it and what not to include in it. So it's not a one size fits all, which is sort of, I think, the beauty of the contract, even though labor law is very complicated and in some ways frustrating in the United States. That flexibility, I think, is something that's an important component and can be really beneficial. That being said, there's some specific stuff I would point to that most union contracts entail. I think the most basic one that almost every contract has is something called just cause. And just cause changes the nature of your employment. So most people, maybe who have worked as salaried employees in the United States, understand that they're at-will employees, which it's sort of a technical term, but essentially means that you can be terminated as an employee at any time for more or less any reason. I mean, obviously not, illegal discrimination, but there's little to no protections that you have against being fired. And just cause changes the nature of that employment. So it basically says you can only be fired for certain just causes. So it can take different forms, but it's an important protection of the security of your job. And once you have that, it opens up a whole other world of organizing because if you're protected as an employee, it increases your voice as an employee. So just cause is a super important one. Then there's a whole other host of benefits you can get in a union contract. And Um, if you look at AWU's Instagram page, you can see that we have posted a lot of the clauses that were in Bernheimer's contract, and they really cover a broad swath of what's of interest to architects. There are items in there about remote work. There are items about moonlighting, overtime hours, hours of work, and I'd really recommend everyone go look at Architectural Workers United on Instagram because there's some really nice summaries of some of what's in that contract. And at our office, we're negotiating contract now. Some of our interests and goals are the same as what Bernheimer had. Some of them are different. And when we eventually have a contract, we hope to share some of that in more detail. The one thing I'll sort of add that goes beyond the scope of any individual office and is a big piece of Architectural Workers United is that there's a concept called union density, which refers to within an industry how many offices are unionized. And this is sort of the broader goal because building unions in individual office builds power in those offices, but uh, growing unions across an industry grows power for workers across that industry. And there are sort of compounding benefits to that. So in industries where you see high union density, where most workers are unionized, it can drive up standards. It can kind of set floors on expectations of employment, wages, hours of work, etc. So I think this is a major goal because when you reach that point, even without having all offices unionized, you have the power collectively in the industry to push the entire culture of the industry. And I think ultimately that's a vision that a lot of us within AWU have for our industry.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, really great to get kind of that further kind of explanation of what types of things typically go into a contract. And I was wondering, yeah, so let's say you're an architectural worker in the United States who is interested in unionizing their workplace. What's the process that leads from kind of starting with this intent as an individual or as a group, and then head and getting towards signing that contract?
It's an interesting process because there are some parts of it that are extremely variable, and then there are some parts that are very rigid in terms of the labor law. So to have a union in the United States, at least in the private sector, you're working under the National Labor Relations Act, which is from the 1930s, and it's governed by a federal entity called the National Labor Relations Board. And there's an excruciating amount of detail in all of that. But the basics I think that you need to know, and I'll work backwards because I've already mentioned contract, is before you get a contract, you have to bargain for the contract with your employer. And in order to bargain for the contract with your employer, you need to be recognized in some way as a union. And there are fundamentally two ways that can happen in an office or in a, it's not always an office, it could be an organization. It's not just the private sector necessarily. But the two pathways are, I'll describe the more typical one first, which is through a union election. And I think a lot of people are familiar with this idea, and you hear about it in the news of workers voting to have a union. And the way that works is that a certain number of employees have to do what's called signing cards, which is essentially expressing their desire to have an election. And once you have reached a certain threshold, the law requires an election to be held, and if a majority of the workers want a union, one is formed and it's registered under the labor board. All that being said, that's not the process our office used, nor is it the process that Bernheimer used. So we used another process which is called voluntary recognition. And voluntary recognition is typically used in cases where it's very evident that employees want a union and or that it's a smaller bargaining unit. So in our case, for example, everyone who was in our bargaining unit, so essentially everyone who's allowed to be in the union, unanimously wanted the union. And we expressed that to our employer. So it was clear that having an election would be a formality. And it was also clear that we sort of had the solidarity that an election would be irrelevant, more or less. So in that case, and it's more of a collaborative process, the employer sort of talks to you, and this happened also at Bernheimer, and says, "Okay, we recognize you voluntarily," and there's a form they send to the labor board, and then you also similarly did, if you had had an election, your union is recognized. So working backwards even further, before all of that is a little bit more the open end because there's many ways you can organize to get to the point that you either sign cards to have an election or request voluntary recognition. And that's really the meat of organizing is the getting your workplace and your colleagues to a place that you have the solidarity and have built the power to ask for the union. And we could talk all day about the different forms of organizing, but a lot of it is relational. It's talking to your coworkers, it's meetings. In many cases, ours included, involves working with a representative from a larger union. So, as you mentioned, we worked with the Machinists and Aerospace Workers, the IAM, and worked with some really wonderful, super helpful, intelligent organizers from that union. Um, But every office is different. The ways to build power are different depending on the particular issues of your workplace. Typically, organizing involves identifying sort of shared interests and concerns and trying to articulate those in a way that everyone can understand what the benefits of the union would be and how they might help solve those issues. but it's really at the creative part of the process, and I really loved it personally as an architectural worker to use that part of my brain too. That's sometimes in architecture we don't get that opportunity to do the more relational one-on-one work, and it was a nice counterpoint to my architectural work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's exhilarating. I mean, even working on a project like this, but just with being in a room, kind of working outside of the compulsions of your daily job in, yeah, to be to kind of the same social end as another group of workers is a wonderful experience. And yeah, it's really great that we're bringing kind of this conversation about how to unionize workplace from like the abstract to something very concrete. How does this procedure work? And we're running towards the tail end of our time,
Mhm.
but I would be really curious what kind of advice you would give to folks who, you know, would like to be in a union, but or would like to organize a workplace, but yeah, they're intimidated by or unsure how to kind of, yeah, go by starting this organizational process or advice for folks who are trying to think about, yeah, the practice of organizing.
Of course, it's not easy, and I think at our office we had a lot of fits and starts. Organizing often begins at a place where it's not specifically about unions, because there's all sorts of other ways to organize power in your office, and I think one entry point is to think about taking those little things you may already be doing. If it's as simple as employees, getting together for a drink after work, and how you sort of build those piece by piece into a bigger and more formal campaign. Um, I sort of like to make an analogy to making a building for architects, because I think this might resonate with people, which is that I think building a building is such a long process, and it starts with so much uncertainty, and so sort of the blank space of design can be really intimidating to architects, I think. And one skill I think we learn as designers is how do you take this space that has just incredible ambiguity and uncertainty about how you're going to get there to what you are going to build in the end, and start. And I think we have a lot of tools as architects to do that. And I think on the organizing side, you need to sort of do the same. Find a way to jump in before you can even envision exactly how it's going to go. And a few things I'll say of ways to do that. I think the most critical in my mind is finding a way to talk with your coworkers and talk in a way that you're really connecting with them, understanding their concerns, finding shared points of interest. And I think this can be really uncomfortable. The more you practice it, the easier it will be. Depends, of course, on the size of the office. But um, at the beginning, for me, I think it was a hard thing to find the sort of right moment to bring up the idea of unions with a coworker. How are they going to react? And I think one thing I learned in the process is that if you're genuine about it, if you um, know why you care about it, I found everyone meets you there and is really interested and wants to learn more. Um, I would say don't sweat the strategy so much, just get started. Strategy is important, but the most important thing is building the power. And if you do that well, the strategy will work itself out. And then the final thing, and I think this is something I'm really proud of about our union. Um, the piece of advice I would give, because I think we did a pretty good job of this, is do your absolute best not to replicate the sort of unhealthy habits or culture of architecture or the things that you're trying to correct with your union. Do your best to not replicate those in how you do your organizing. So if you feel you work in an office where your time is not respected, make sure that your union meetings are really respectful of people's time. If you feel that communication is not clear in your office, make sure that within your union organizing, you're communicating really clearly. And those are just some examples, and it's hard to do because, you're always doing this as an extracurricular thing. You're finding time after work. Everyone is busy, but I think if you're attentive to that, people are really responsive to that. I think when people are respected and when the culture you build in the union is one that people can look to as a model and a example of good practices, it goes a long way and will build a lot of power.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fantastic advice. Yeah, to yeah, not to not to sweat the strategy, and to yeah, take the punch. Do it.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, I
good for you.
think, yeah, there's always those moments where you're thinking, what is the right timing? What is the right language? What is the right way to say this?
Hmm.
And I think when I look back on it on the broad scope, there's a lot of moments where I would have wished we had just kind of jumped in and, you know, hope that everyone would, you know, meet you with a little grace and even if your strategy is not perfect or you bungle the language a little bit. And especially in architecture where we're many of us are doing this for the first time. I think everyone has to kind of understand, you're gonna not do anything perfectly the first time, but it will all work out in the end.